Hey BookTube! I am the Book Mage, and today I'm going to be bringing you my October and also November wrap-up. So you may remember back in October I posted a very ambitious TBR. It was basically everything I wanted to read for like October, Halloween, like the spooky season, so everything like dark and gothic and that sort of vibe. And I think I had like 11 or 12-ish books on that TBR, and I knew that it was going to be a struggle. However, I did not anticipate that I would fail quite as bad as I did, and yet here we are. So the reason that this is an October and November wrap-up is because I hadn't finished my last book at the end of October, and then November is NaNoWriMo, so I kind of didn't even read one book in the whole of November because I was so busy with doing the Nano stuff. So it was not the best 2 months for reading. That said, I do have a total of 5 books to wrap up for you today from the past 2 months. And then hopefully December will be better. So the first book I read at the start of October was Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice. And this one is actually a reread for me. This is one of my all-time favourite books, just ever. I love this book so much. And I continue to love it. I still rated this book 5 out of 5 stars upon my reread. This is a very dark and like supremely gothic vampire story. It's set in New Orleans and it follows a man named Louis as he becomes a vampire and learns his new immortal nature. A lot of this book is just Louis being supremely depressed, but honestly, a bitch can relate. Essentially, he's recounting his life story to a journalist, and given that he's a vampire, it's a long and eventful life. So if you haven't read this and you do like dark literature, anything gothic or anything with vampires, I highly recommend picking this up. So the main reason that I wanted to reread this was just because it was the Halloween season and I just kind of felt like something that I knew that I would love and that would fit like the ambiance of the season. And I'm very glad I picked it up again because I still really love it. The second book that I read in the month of October was Wayward Son by Rainbow Rowell, and this one is the edition that I have, but if you've seen my book haul, you'll know I have a few too many editions of this book. So this is a sequel to Rainbow Rowell's Carry On, and so I won't say like too much about the plot in case you haven't read the first one and don't really want spoilers, but essentially it just kind of follows on from where the first book left off, and it involves the characters going on a like cross-America road trip. I won't really say too much about the plot, but like the biggest themes in this book tend to be stuff like mental health and depression. I feel like for a YA book it handles it well, and there were some scenes in this that I really enjoyed. I really liked part of the direction that it took with some of the characters. But ultimately, compared to the first installment, it did fall a little bit flat for me. I felt like the end especially was just too quick and jarring. I felt a little bit like I had whiplash, it just ended very suddenly, and it is a very short book. It's much shorter than the first one, and I found out it's because there's going to be another follow-up to this series, so there will be a book 3 maybe coming out next year, I don't know. And I kind of got the impression that maybe partway through writing this as one book, the author just kind of got the idea to just split it in the middle kind of haphazardly and just say, yeah, release this part as one book and the rest of it, like the actual conclusion to this story, is in the next book. So I wasn't really a big fan of that, and while I did really enjoy being back in this world and back with these characters, because it's just a very fun, light-hearted, sort of almost contemporary style fantasy, I did only rate it about just a 3 stars because it wasn't really what I was hoping to get out of the sequel. The third book I read in October was very much in keeping with the like seasonal vibes, and that was Wakenhurst by Michelle Paver. So while I did enjoy this novel, I feel like I have to say the synopsis to this book is entirely misleading and completely wrong. So to sum it up, this book follows a young girl named Maud as she grows up in her father's household. It's set in like the late 1800s, and so obviously as a young girl she's like very affected by, I guess, like the opinions of the time as a woman, and her father's like especially strict in his like sexism, even in that day and age. She lives in an old manor house on the Fens in Suffolk. So this is not a spoiler, this is the very first thing that the book tells you, like basically on page 1, and it is that at this manor house where Maud lived with her father, there was a murder and her father was arrested for the murder. However, there are some really strange circumstances surrounding it. One being that Maud was the only witness and her father was behaving very strangely, and some people seem to think that maybe he didn't commit the murder, maybe it was Maud, maybe it was somebody else, and nobody knows what happened. And Maud has never given, like, aside from to the police that one time, she's never given like an official statement or recounting of what actually happened on that day. So going into it, you kind of have this constant like tension in the back of your mind, as you know that as time progresses back from the start of the story towards the end, like you know where you're going to end up and it's this point of trying to piece together, I suppose, how the events of the story will end up at a murder. And the story is really about her trying to like gain like little bits of freedom and independence for herself. But against that, the kind of driving force of the story is that her father is a medieval historian, and he's like investigating and translating this old like Middle English diary, this work by this woman who was either thought to be like a saint or a witch. And while he's doing this, he stumbles upon this painting of a medieval devil in the churchyard, and it starts this like series of events where things get progressively creepier and weirder. He seems to think that something in the painting is real and after him, and Maud is trying to work out like, is there really something going on? What has got her father riled up so much? And she's also kind of trying to look into like the secrets of his past to see like why this is affecting him so much. It's told partly through Maud's perspective, and then the other half is told through like reading her father's like diary entries. So that to me is kind of the basic plot, but I feel like I was entirely misled with the synopsis. Right at the bottom it says firstly that Maud must survive a world haunted by witchcraft, and then also that like the story of this spans 5 centuries. Both of those things do not really occur in the book, and they're entirely included, I think, on like a technicality. The 5 centuries thing is because the manuscript that her father is investigating is an old one, and there is no witchcraft whatsoever in this book. It's not even mentioned once, aside from in these accounts of like this woman from the past, where at one point people were like, oh, maybe she's a witch and maybe we should burn her, and then it was kind of like a maybe she's not that bad. There was literally no witchcraft or mention of witchcraft anywhere else in the novel. There was no like magic or anything like that. All the superstition is like based on like sin and religion and divine punishment and guilt and that sort of thing. Like there's no witches or witchcraft anywhere in this book. And the thing about the 5 centuries kind of made me think that Maud was going to be uncovering like this witchcraft based mystery about like, I don't know, magic or curses or something that was affecting the Fen or her home. And I kind of thought it would be one of those things where things that you learned, like events from the past, like 500 years in the past, would suddenly be like, oh, that explains this that's going on today. And like, do you know what I mean? Like when the past and the present sort of like, you know, intertwine. None of that. The whole 500 years thing is that literally just that her father is investigating this medieval thing because he's a medieval historian. I feel kind of scammed. So it was a very, very atmospheric read, and it's much more about like the struggles of a young woman in this time and how that really plays into like the narrative and the plot, rather than this whole witchcraft thing. So if you completely forget any mention of like witchcraft and like a story 500 years in the making, and just see it as like this few years like leading up from being a normal household to this horrific event that happens and all this weird stuff that goes on in between, if you focus on that, then I feel like you would probably enjoy this a lot more going into it if you actually know what it's actually about. So in that sense, if you're looking for something like overtly magical and witchy, this is not the book for you. But if you just want like a creepy or atmospheric read based in like this one young girl's struggle to just sort of like carve a little place for herself and also figure out what the hell is going on with her weird father, then this book might be of interest. I think that I rated this one about a 3 stars. I wasn't really that impressed with it, and I feel like it was fairly predictable and there were some plot holes. So yeah, I thought it was good. I thought it was like an okay atmospheric read for the season, but I'm not particularly impressed with it. Okay, next is the last book that I actually read and finished in October, and that is The Beautiful by Renee Ahdieh. And again, this one is the version that I tabbed up, because again, if you've seen that vlog, you'll know that I got sent multiple copies of this book. So this is like a YA paranormal romance, and it follows a French seamstress named Celine Rousseau who is fleeing France for unknown reasons, but she's essentially running away from her past, and she's come to New Orleans to start her life anew. I know, I get it, like what is it with so many vampires being set in New Orleans? Celine goes to live at a convent with some other young women, where the aim is to either like find her a job and a husband and that sort of thing. But she ends up getting involved with this group of people called La Cour de Lion, who are sort of like a bunch of weird and varied aristocrats who are kind of in their own way obsessed with the occult and all have sort of like strange skills. But Celine ends up making friends with them, except for their leader Sebastian, who despite being charismatic and devilishly handsome, she just does not like this man. I feel like you know where it's going. So the plot of this novel is that while Celine is trying to find her footing in the new world, this grisly string of murders begins to happen around her, and it begins to hit close to home when girls at the convent start going missing and turning up dead. Celine wants to find out what happened to the girls, and also she starts to fear for her own life when she starts to suspect that maybe she is potentially the next one in danger. So I feel like it's not a spoiler to say that this is primarily meant to be a vampire novel, and the marketing for this book was very insistent that this was a vampire novel. However, if you go into this book expecting like a load of vampire stuff, you will be very disappointed. It's very much one of those like cliche gothic vampire feeling stories, and there are vampires like in this. Obviously the marketing didn't lie, but I just feel that this book would have been so much better if you just didn't know anything about the vampires going into it. It gives off such a strong like cliche vampy gothic kind of vibe like as you're reading this. Like, I feel like most of my thoughts about this book can't really be summed up without spoilers, because it's all kind of about like the supernatural side of it. I will say, if you have read this, like I guess I'll say like the whole villain reveal was, it made me groan internally for how tropey I felt like it was. But again, that's as someone who's like, I'm gonna say like a hardcore veteran of like anything vampire. And I feel like your reaction to a lot of this will depend entirely on like how familiar you are with like this kind of story and this kind of setting being done in like a million other different ways. For me, I enjoyed it, and I think I am going to hang on until the sequel, because going into it I thought that maybe this would be a standalone, and I wish it had been a standalone, but it's the setup to what I'm imagining is either going to be like a trilogy or a tetralogy or something like that. So I think overall I ended up rating this a 3 stars, maybe like 3 and a bit stars. It was good. It was a bit like guilty pleasure-y in like how cliche it was a lot of the time, but a lot of the things that it brought to the table that were very fresh I thought were like really good. I really liked Celine actually as a character. I feel like female protagonists in like paranormal romances tend to fall into a particular kind of niche, and Celine doesn't do that. She's very headstrong, she thinks things through, and you know, I'm not saying that she's like a flawless character who never makes mistakes, but she has ambition and drive, and she makes a lot of her own decisions. She's like a very proactive character rather than a reactive character, and I really appreciated that. There are also a lot of strong like female-female relationships in here, so she has like a lot of strong female friends, and there's a lot of like female camaraderie in here, which I was just honestly just living for. I really enjoyed it. And her best friend Pippa is from Yorkshire, and like, what can I say? I'm also a Yorkshire lass, so I guess Pippa has like my shitty accent. I do also think that, especially for like a YA paranormal romance, I feel like the romance was done in a way that didn't make me completely cringe. I didn't think it was like the best thing that I've ever read, again because I'm used to reading like adult books, but I feel like this is possibly like the most like spicy and intense, and like of all the relationships I've read in like YA books, this one tends to have like the most spark, I think. So if you're particularly fond of the romance side of paranormal romance, then I feel like this one probably a good bet for you. Finally, the last book I read, which I started in October and I did not finish until the start of December because I just could not read through November. I just couldn't do it. But that book was The Quick by Lauren Owen. Again, this is another vampire story. I am so glad I read this. I cannot believe I've never heard anybody else, particularly the channels I follow specifically who talk about like gothic literature and vampires. None of them have ever talked about this book, and therefore I think it is criminally overlooked, because this was like really fantastic. It is very hard to kind of sum up what this book is about, because it takes place over quite a long period of time and it follows so many characters, like so many characters. I guess the short of it is that there is a brother and sister who are born and grow up in Yorkshire, again with a Yorkshire rep, and the brother James goes off to university and then moves to London to become a poet. He ends up renting like an apartment with another young man, and all throughout London there is talk of this particular club called the Agolius Club, and it's very exclusive and secretive and mysterious, and nobody ever sees inside, and it's very hard to be admitted. Nobody is quite sure like what the criteria for gaining admittance to the club is, but it seems to be that the only people who are ever admitted are very young, rich white men. as you would expect. So without really spoiling anything, one day James's sister Charlotte stops kind of receiving his letters and she decides to go to London to see what's going on with her brother and why he's no longer in contact with her. And I'm not really quite sure how much to say because that's mentioned in the synopsis, but it's also like halfway through the book because again this jumps through so many characters' perspectives and tells like so many different chunks of the story at kind of different intervals that you're like jumping back and forth through time. So I don't really want to say very much more than that, other than this is a Victorian vampire novel set in London and it's very like wintry themed and it's very like fresh, I think, for a vampire genre. It's very cliche, I guess, in its sort of depiction of vampires, but it did a lot of things that I've never seen vampire books do, in that I think the word vampire is mentioned like maybe like twice in the whole novel. It is like gothic horror fiction, but it's also, it's very, to me, it's like borderline like literary fiction. I'm not sure if it's just because it's set in like London, but I have heard a few other people mention it, that it feels very almost Dickensian. I'm not sure if that's just because of like the massive cast of characters, or the fact that everyone has like very weird names. Is one of those things where it's like, it almost feels like it mirrors like a play where everyone's name has to mean something. But it just felt so different from any other vampire book I've ever read, and I really, really, really loved it for that. The cast of characters is fantastic as well. There are a lot of like really, really good, strong female characters in this, and they're all sort of like strong characters in very different ways. But there are also female vampires in this, and there is a female vampire hunter who I've never read anything like that stalking Jack the Ripper, but it seems to me like if you like that and you maybe want a character who's kind of like an adult version of like that kind of story, because she's a badass fighting lady who sometimes like wears men's clothing and goes out into battle and like solves vampire mystery things. She's not like a main character, but she is like a major character, and I loved like all like the weird society. It's almost as like there's this people, it's like certain levels of society know about vampires and know that they exist and know that vampire hunters exist, and there's this whole like underworld of like stuff going on like just beneath the surface that so many people are aware of, and it's like, how is this all just going on like in London? Obviously, being a vampire book with like so many POV characters and just so many characters in general, there are obviously going to be a lot of character deaths within this, and without spoiling anything, I will say my personal favourite character did die and I was heartbroken. So yes, I really, really loved this book, and I feel like I wish there was more like gothic and vampire literature that's like this, because it's very dark and quite bleak, but also at the same time it's quite whimsical. I don't really know how else to describe it. It feels just so, it just has such an atmosphere about it, and I really, really enjoyed reading this book. And I'm kind of disappointed that it took me so long to actually get through it, just because I had so many other obligations that were preventing me from reading. But this is definitely one that I want to reread at a later date, just to like make sure that I definitely got like, I guess like the full impact of this book, because reading it over the span of like a month and a bit was maybe slightly too slow for the pace of this book. But nevertheless, I did love it, and I think I rated this about a 4.5, 4.25-ish. I'm not entirely sure, but like it's definitely more than a 4 stars. But I definitely think that like technically and story-wise and the way that it's written, it is such a fantastic novel, and I really, really love this. And if you want anything that's sort of like dark and vampire-y, but like really cold and wintry feeling and set in Victorian London, then I would highly recommend this, because it was so good. So there you go, there are the 5 books that I read in the months of October and November. I'm really hoping that December will be a better month for reading, but I feel like quality-wise what I read was not too bad. And like, come on, 4 out of these 5 books have vampires, so like that has to count for something. So that's it from me. Thank you so much for watching, and if I haven't put you off too much by just like constantly ranting about vampires, then maybe you'll consider like checking out some of the other stuff on my channel. I mainly do adult fantasy, but I always have time for vampires. So thanks for watching, and I will hopefully see you guys in the next video. Bye!